Chapter 7, Global Stratification. Systems of stratification. Social stratification is the division of large numbers of people into layers according to their relative power, property, and prestige. It applies to both nations and to people within a nation, society, or other groups. Social stratification affects all of our life chances, from access to material possessions and positions in society to life expectancy. All societies stratify its members, although they may differ in which system or form they use. The four major systems of stratification, of social stratification, are slavery, caste, estate, and class. Slavery is a form of social stratification in which some people own other people and has been common throughout history. In its earliest form, slavery was based on debt. People who could not pay their debts were enslaved. Punishment for violation of the law or a crime, or defeat in a battle or war. Historian Gerda Lerner reports that women were the first people enslaved through warfare. They were valued for sexual purposes, reproduction, and their labor. Slavery was common in Greece 2,500 years ago. The Romans enslaved the Greeks 2,000 years ago. With regards to the conditions of slavery, slavery could be temporary or permanent, and was not necessarily passed on to one's children. Typically, slaves owned no property and had no power, but this was not universal. In some instances, in some groups, slaves could own property. Bonded labor, especially in the New World. The first form of slavery in the New World was bonded labor or indentured service. This was a contract system where someone voluntarily sold his or her services for a specific amount, usually a specific amount of time. At the end of the time, the individual was freed. Many did this for a passage to the New World, to pay for and earn their passage onto a ship that was traveling to the New World. Slavery in the New World, given the shortage of indentured servants, American colonists first tried to enslave Native Americans or Indians, and then they turned to Africans, who were being brought to North and South America by the British, the Dutch, and the English, also the Portuguese and the Spanish. Because of the many reasons for slavery, researchers conclude that slavery led to racism and not the other way around. When American slave owners found there to be profit in owning slaves, they developed an ideology or beliefs that justify the social arrangements. In this case, that owning slaves was necessary and fair because slaves were inferior. Slave states passed laws that made slavery inheritable. That is, the slaves' children could be sold, bartered, or traded. The practice of slavery was written into law. Slavery today. There is some debate as to whether or not slavery is still practiced in certain parts of the world today. We have what is known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which prohibits slavery in all of its forms. This modern-day slavery is usually in the form of children for work and the sex trade. So that's where we do find some instances where slavery exists today. The Uniform Trafficking Report shows levels of compliance to this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which prohibits the slavery. Next, we have caste systems. A caste system is the second system of stratification. The status in a caste system is really determined by birth, which is an ascribed status and is lifelong. So ascribed status is the basis of the caste system. Caste societies try to make certain that boundaries between castes remain firm. They do this by practicing endogamy, which is marriage within one's own group. They also developed rules about ritual pollution. This teaches that contact with someone in the inferior caste may contaminate the superior caste. Touching a member of the inferior caste makes a member of the superior caste unclean. India's religious caste. Although it was abolished by the Indian government in 1949, the caste system remains part of everyday life in India, as it has for almost 3,000 years. This system is based on religion and is made up of 4 main castes. These 4 are then subdivided into thousands of specialized subcastes called jati. Each jati specializes in a particular occupation, like washing clothes or repairing shoes. The Brahmin are the priests and the teachers. The Kshatriya are rulers and soldiers. Vaishya are merchants and traders. The Shudra are peasants and laborers. And then the Dalit, or the untouchables, the outcasts. They do the degrading and the polluting labor. The lowest caste, the Dalit, are known as the untouchables. If higher caste are contaminated by the untouchables, then they must go through an ablution, ablution. This is a washing ritual to make them pure again. In South Africa, there was a caste system which was called apartheid, and that was based on the separation of the races. By law, there were 4 different racial castes: the Europeans, or the whites, the Africans were the blacks, the colors, which were mixed races, and then the Asians. The law specified where people could live, work, and go to school. While the system has been dismantled by the government after decades of international protest, Nelson Mandela fought against apartheid and spent years in prison, but eventually he became president in 1994. Apartheid's legacy, though, continues to haunt South Africa. While whites still dominate in social institutions, and blacks remain poor and often uneducated. Political violence has been replaced by street crime. So there's a high murder rate. Prejudice, bitterness, hatred fuel racial tensions. Now, in the United States, we don't usually think of castes in the U.S., but an American racial caste system developed in the U.S. when slavery ended. So even in the early parts of this century, all whites were considered higher than all African Americans. Laws were put into place to prevent intermarriage. Separate accommodations were maintained for the races in the South. Segregation in schools, restaurants, drinking fountains, etc. Just like the untouchables in India. If an African American was walking and a white was coming along on the sidewalk, they had to cross over. And here is the illustration of India's caste system. Priests and teachers at the very top of the pyramid, rulers and soldiers make up the next level, merchants and traders the next level, peasants and laborers in the next level, and at the very bottom of the pyramid is the Dalit, or the outcasts, doing the degrading or polluting labor. Next we have estates. During the Middle Ages, Europe developed the estate stratification system, consisting of 3 groups or estates. The first estate was made up of the nobility, who ruled the land. They were wealthy families. They administered the land, they defended the king, and they lived very high status lives. The nobility practiced what is known as primogeniture, which allowing only the firstborn son to inherit land, so that the vast land holdings wouldn't be divided into small chunks. The other sons had to find some other way to support themselves, and many of them became clergy and joined the church, which is the second estate. That consisted of the clergy. They not only owned vast tracts of land and collected taxes from commoners, but they also set its seal of approval on rulers. Kings had to obtain the Pope's permission, so the church had power. Clergy held lifetime positions, and they also could sell their positions. For example, a wealthy man could buy the position of bishop for his son. The third estate was made up of commoners, known as serfs, and they belonged to the land. If the land is bought or sold, the serfs go with it. They are born into this estate, another ascribed status, and they had few opportunities to move up. But the few ways out were to be knighted for bravery or to be called into a religious vocation, but this was rare. If we look at women in the estate system, where do they fit in? Well, women belonged to the estate of their husbands. Those women in the first estate, they did not work. The same as the husbands, it was beneath them. But they did take care of the household and the children, overseeing the servants. Women in the second estate were nuns, since the Roman Catholic clergy did not marry. Women in the third estate worked along with their husbands, doing physical labor. They had a hard life, and they faced food shortages too, just like their husbands. But they also faced abuse by men of the first estate. Rarely men in the first estate would marry a woman in the third. The class system. The class system is a form of social stratification based primarily on the possession of money or material possessions. It's an open system, which is considered an achieved status, in which you can move from one group to another, compared to a closed system, which is an ascribed status, in which there is little to no mobility. Initial social class position is based on one's parents, an ascribed status. But unlike the other systems, these are relatively fluid boundaries. A class system allows for social mobility, or the movement up or down the social ladder based on achieved status. The potential to move up the social class ladder is what motivates people to work hard to further their educations. Social class is very significant in our lives. The social class of our families may either present a child with privileges or obstacles in their attempt to climb the social ladder. For example, those from poor, lower class families may not be able to afford to send their children to school or pay for extracurricular activities like sports, while those from wealthy families can afford education and opportunities for their children. So, for example, our social location, where a person lives, can afford some better opportunities. No matter the system used to divide people into different strata, gender is always an essential part of the distinctions within each layer. On the basis of gender, people are sorted into categories and given different access to rewards. Social distinctions have always favored males. In every society, men's earnings are higher than women's, and most of the world's illiterate are women, indicating women's relative position in society. Here you see the distribution of the Earth's wealth, and so this is worldwide. In the next chapter, we'll see what it looks like in the United States. So on the left side, you see two pie charts where the wealthiest 10% of adults worldwide own 86% of the Earth's wealth. On the right side of the dotted line, we see the wealthiest 1% of adults worldwide own 46% of the Earth's wealth. So these are showing the proportion of wealth in the world owned by the wealthiest people. So what determines social class? So we're going to take a look at Karl Marx and the means of production, but we're also going to look at Max Weber, property, power, and prestige. So Karl Marx is the main theorist that comes to mind when we discuss the meaning of social class. According to Karl Marx, social class is determined by one's relationship to the means of production. The means of production are the tools, the factories, the land and investment capital used to produce wealth. And he believed there to be two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, or the capitalist, were the owners, or the people who own the means of production. The proletariat, or the workers, those are the people who were exploited by the capitalists, by the bourgeoisie, those who worked for the owners. While Marx recognized other groups, he did not consider these groups social classes because they lacked class consciousness. Class consciousness is an awareness of a common identity based on position in the means of production. As capital becomes more concentrated, the two classes will become increasingly hostile to one another. Class consciousness will develop. It is necessary for the unity of the workers, according to Karl Marx. Now, Marx believed that the workers would revolt against the capitalist. They would take control of the means of production and create a classless society. So he viewed this as sort of a utopia. The workers, although the workers are held back by what he calls a false consciousness, which is a mistaken identification of workers with the interests of the capitalist. In other words, workers need to develop that class consciousness, not a false one, uniting together because, according to Marx, property determines lifestyles. It establishes relationships with one another and even shapes ideas. Unlike Marx, Max Weber did not believe that property was the basis for a person's position in the stratification system. Max Weber argued that it is not just class, but class, power, and status that determine a person's social class position in society. Max Weber said that social class has three components: class, or property or wealth; power, which equals control; and status or prestige. So first, property or wealth is an essential element. However, people need to be owners to be powerful. So in his argument, managers of corporations also control the means of productions, although they don't necessarily own them. Power, the second element of social class, is the ability to control others, even over their objections. So property is a major source of power, but so are some other sources. Political power, there's legal power. Prestige, the third element, is derived from property ownership, but also other factors as well. You gain prestige from, athletics and being a celebrity, being a hero. Actors and musicians also gain prestige. So these three elements tend to be interrelated. So let's take someone, for example, as a combination of the three elements. JFK is a good example. John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy had wealth, or the property, and he was from an upper class family. He had prestige. He graduated Harvard, so he had the status and prestige of graduating from an Ivy League college, university. He also had power, political power, because he became president of the United States. So there's a combination of all these three elements that are interrelated, wrapped up into one person, John F. Kennedy. So why is that social stratification universal? We're going to take a look at our theoretical perspectives. Social life is stratified in all societies, and we can find explanations in functionalist theory and conflict theory, and even taking a look at Lenski's synthesis. The functionalist view, motivating qualified people. Let's be reminded that functionalists believe that patterns of behavior that categorize society exist because they are functional for society. They function to maintain social stability. According to two functionalists, Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore, stratification was inevitable for four reasons. First, for society to function, it must make certain that its important positions are filled. We need people to become doctors, but we also need people to become plumbers. Second, some positions are more important than others. Thirdly, more important positions need to be filled by the more qualified people. And finally, these people must be offered greater rewards to be motivated to fill these positions. Now, Davis and Moore were not trying to justify social inequality, but rather they tried to explain why it exists. Melvin Tooman was the first sociologist to critique Davis and Moore's explanation. First, he asked how the importance of a position is measured. For example, is a surgeon really more important to society than a garbage collector? Something to think about. Secondly, he noted that if stratification worked like Davis and Moore described it, society would be a meritocracy, which is a form of social stratification in which all positions are awarded on the basis of merit. Merit is when someone is particularly good at something and they deserve a reward. But this is not how things work. People's positions in society are based on many other factors other than merit. For example, the best predictor of college entrance is family income, not ability. The third critique, he noted, was that stratification is dysfunctional to many people, not functional. If it was functional, it should benefit everybody. But what about those born into poverty? Women. They are at a disadvantage due to no fault of their own. We have the conflict perspective, where class conflict and scarce resources are important. Conflict theorists stress that conflict, not function, is the basis for social stratification. And there are three views in this perspective. We've got Mosca, Marx, and then we have the more current applications. Every society has only limited resources to go around, and in every society, groups struggle with one another for those resources. So first, Italian sociologist Gaetano Mosca argued that it is inevitable that society will be stratified by power. He said that society cannot exist unless it is organized. Therefore, there must be politics to coordinate people's actions and get the work of society done. Political organization results in inequalities of power because some people take leadership positions and other people will follow. And thirdly, it's in a human's nature to be self-centered, he argued. Therefore, people in power, in those powerful positions, will use their power to bring greater rewards to themselves. Well, then we have Karl Marx's view. And Karl Marx's view is that human history is the history of class struggle. Those in power use society's resources to benefit themselves and to oppress others. He predicted that the workers would unite and revolt against their oppression as soon as they realized their common oppression, their class consciousness. And then we have the modern conflict theory that stresses that conflict between capitalists and workers is not the only important conflict in contemporary society, but rather groups within the same class compete for scarce resources. We have men versus women. We have the young versus the old, resulting in conflict between many groups. Think about in the competition just in the search for a job, for jobs, education, for housing, there are different, certain limited number of spots for those positions. And so if you have a young person and an old person competing for that one spot, or a man versus a woman, so you have those different competing conflicts that a current contemporary conflict theorist would be studying. And here we lay out the functionalist and the conflict views on stratification, the distribution of society's resources. Who receives the most resources? Who receives the least? Now, Gerhard Lenski offered a synthesis between the functionalist and the conflict theories. He suggested that surplus was the key. Lenski is known for his socio-cultural evolution approach. His focus is on technology and material resources, how society advanced from hunter and gathering societies, agricultural societies, agrarian societies, into industrial societies, post-industrial and postmodern societies. So Lenski suggested that functionalists are right when it comes to societies that have only basic resources and do not accumulate wealth, such as hunting and gathering societies. Little to no class division existed, and everyone shared. Conflict theorists are right when it comes to societies with a surplus, as we moved toward industrialization. In these societies, humans pursue self-interest and struggle to control their surpluses. This leads to a small elite who then build inequality into the society, resulting in a full-blown system of social stratification. So as stratification evolves, as surplus develops.